Hello, it's Mr. Egg here. This is part 3 of our R-Tune love story, Paul's Story. If you haven't seen the first 2 episodes, then click on the playlist at the top of the screen and watch episodes 1 and 2. Rose had come home from work that evening quite late and told Paul to sit down because she had something important to tell him. Paul sat down and he was quite hopeful that it might be good news. He knew that she played the Thai lottery and he was thinking in his head, well, maybe she's won the jackpot, even though Thailand is 6,000 miles away. But Rose was not smiling, and so he knew that it was more serious than that. And then she started crying. So this was very serious. Rose explained that she couldn't get the time off from work at the end of December. And if you remember, they were planning to go to Thailand together to celebrate not only Rose's birthday, but also Christmas and New Year, and also to see Rose's family in Nakhon Ratchasima or Korat. Well, this was very bad news for Paul, but he felt that it wasn't Rose's fault because Rose had booked the time off in advance, but circumstances at the hotel had changed. There were party bookings that had been received by the hotel later on in December, and they needed the trained staff to be able to be at the parties to make sure that they ran smoothly. There was a little bit of good news. Rose would be getting double time, which meant that she'd get double her salary for the time that she'd be at the parties. And she didn't have to work on New Year's Eve. The problem was that Paul had already booked the flight and the accommodation in Thailand, and it was high season. The end of December, beginning of January, Christmas, New Year, flights are expensive and the hotels were expensive. And now Paul had got to try and rearrange the dates so both him and Rose could now go at the end of December. So the very next day, Paul made a phone call to the travel agents. They were called West East Travel, and he booked with them because they had been the travel agents that booked his original flight on his first journey to Thailand 4 months ago. But the news was not good. Because Paul had booked the cheapest tickets available, they were not transferable. So the outbound portion of the travel couldn't be changed. And also, the travel agent explained to Paul that if they didn't travel on the outbound portion of the journey, then the inbound journey, the return ticket, would be invalidated. So the news was that they had to book brand new tickets. Both he and Rose would have to travel at a later date. And it was even more expensive because the travel dates were later on in December. And of course, the accommodation had to be rebooked as well. So it was all bad news. But that evening, Paul and Rose had their usual Friday night meal, a well-cooked steak at their favourite restaurant, and they accompanied it with their favourite red Italian Barolo wine. Maybe the wine would improve their decision making. The thought of rebooking the whole trip was not very inviting. It was going to be very expensive. And Paul suggested delaying the whole trip until later next year. But this would have messed up Paul's holiday entitlement, and also Rose wasn't too sure how much holiday or time off she'd get from the hotel. And there was no guarantee that they could get free time off together again. What Rose said next really surprised Paul. "But you can still go," said Rose, "and we can travel back together. That means you've only got to buy one new ticket for me. I'll finish my work at the hotel, and then we can meet together in Bangkok and still be together for New Year's Eve." Paul was a bit worried about this idea because he didn't want Rose travelling alone to Bangkok. So Paul says, "Look, Rose, do you want me to cancel my flight?" And Rose said, "No, it's okay. I'll meet you in Bangkok on the 30th of December. Over the next few weeks, Rose was making very little progress in the reason that she had come to England, which was to try and advance her divorce settlement from her husband, who she got divorced from because of his violent and alcoholic nature. Paul accompanied Rose to some of the meetings and heard some of the details of their marriage and was quite shocked and also disappointed that a fellow countryman could treat a woman so badly. But not just any woman. It was Rose, his former wife. Paul promised that in the future they could get married and they would take care of each other, and he would try and be everything that her first husband was not. They planned marriage, which would happen after Paul took early retirement from his job, and they would relocate to Thailand. When he mentioned this to the solicitor that was dealing with Rose's divorce, he strongly advised against it. He didn't want the solicitor and her ex-husband thinking that Rose had moved on into a new relationship and was planning to get married again. So they decided to drop those plans for the foreseeable future. After all, a few more months or a few more years is nothing when you're planning for the rest of your life. Christmas was coming, and Rose seemed to be enjoying working at the hotel, the Royal Victoria, which was just outside Hastings in a small town called St Leonard's. On their days off, they enjoyed visiting historical buildings, and Leeds Castle was a particular favourite. And Rose seemed to be enjoying the cold weather more than Paul, and she was pleading every night with the weather gods. She wanted to see snow. But this year, 2006, although it was cold, it wasn't one of the coldest on record, and that year in England, it never snowed at all. Rose was very disappointed. Even though Rose was brought up in Thailand as a Buddhist, she was looking forward to Christmas time. She liked the tree, the food, the happy children, and the celebrations. Rose had told Paul that one of the highlights of the year at the hotel where she worked was the staff Christmas party. And because of so many private parties that had been booked at the hotel, the staff party would be in the first week of December. And one of the things that she had to do was buy a secret Santa or lucky gift present to take to the party. The only problem was they were told that the present had to be worth around £5 English. And Rose and Paul were thinking to themselves, what can you buy for £5 that somebody would actually want? When she went shopping in Chinatown in London, she'd seen some Thai dried fruit for about £5. So she bought that for the secret Santa at the staff Christmas party because she knew that the people would know who had given it. On the night of the party, Paul drove down to St Leonard's to pick up Rose because he was a bit concerned that she might be a bit tipsy. But actually, when he picked her up, she was in very good spirits and she was quite excited to show Paul the present that she'd received in the secret Santa. She was clutching it in her hand. It was a £4.99 Collins Thai Italian dictionary. Italian, Paul thought. What? Why Italian? And Rose had said to all her staff that she was not only quite keen on the Italian wine that they used to drink at the restaurant every Friday, the Barolo, but also that there were a lot of Italian-speaking guests at the hotel. Now, this comment really surprised Paul because he thought, Italian guests in Hastings? Is she working in St Leonard's or St Leonardo's? And he had a little chuckle when he thought about that joke. Time was moving very quickly for Paul because very soon he'd be leaving on his own to go to Thailand. So Paul found himself sitting on the tarmac on Thai Airways flight TG917, about to take off to go to Bangkok. He was excited, but the only disappointment he had was that Rose would not be with him. The flight was a good one. He had a nice meal accompanied by his favourite red wine, and he settled back in his seat, turned on one of the in-flight music channels and listened to his favourite song, Mariah Carey, We Belong Together. And as the plane was heading towards Bangkok, he fell asleep with Rose in his thoughts. He woke up about 2 hours before the plane was due to land, and when he did land, it was quite exciting because it was a new airport. This was the first year that Suvarnabhumi Airport had opened, and it was new and very shiny. Whilst in Bangkok, Paul had a lot of things to do. He busied himself by having a few meetings with people because Paul had the plan that he would retire from his job when he was 50, and he would need some extra income whilst he and Rose made their new life together in Thailand. So he wanted to set up some kind of business so he had an extra income to help things along. He also had to book a hotel for him and Rose in Bangkok for 2 nights, and also travel arrangements and a hotel for their trip to see Rosie's parents in Korat. Paul would be sleeping alone in the hotel in Nakhon Ratchasima, and Rose would be sleeping at their parents' house. Rose had explained to Paul that it was Thai tradition that they couldn't sleep together in the parents' house unless they were married. Paul was literally counting down the days and hours until Rose was going to be with him again and they would be reunited in Bangkok. Rose was booked on the same flight, the Thai Airways flight, which took off at 10 p.m. from Heathrow, but landed at 4:15 p.m. in Suvarnabhumi. Paul wanted to make sure that he didn't miss Rose at the airport, and he was so excited at her arrival that he set off at midday to meet her. When the flight came in on time, Rose must have been the last passenger to disembark the plane, and it was an old 747 which used to ply that route between London and Bangkok. When they finally met on the 30th of December, back in Thailand, Rose seemed a bit quiet, but Paul thought in his own mind that that was because she just had an 11-hour flight. They went outside and got a taxi together to Pradimpat Road, where Paul had booked them for 2 nights in a 3-star hotel called the Mystic Place. It was a boutique hotel. Each room had been designed by Thai designers around a specific theme, and Paul had booked both he and Rose into a room called the Rice Room. The theme consisted of rice bags on the walls as wall coverings and rice containers as tables. Rose liked the room, but she was very tired, and almost within 5 minutes of their arrival, Rose was fast asleep. Paul was excited. Rose had come back to Thailand, and tomorrow was New Year's Eve, and they were going to hit the party at Siam Square. The next morning, New Year's Eve, Paul was awoken by the sound of running water, and he noticed that Rose had woke up already and was in the shower. So he went in the bathroom and joined her. Paul noticed that she had a red mark on her back. It looked very strange and possibly painful. He asked Rose what it was, and Rose didn't know that it was there and seemed to stumble over her words, and then said to Paul that she remembered the last day of her job at the hotel, there'd been a little accident and the door of the kitchen had smashed into her back, and it had hurt, but she'd brushed it aside because it was a special day. It was a birthday that day. Paul said, "Oh, you poor thing, having to work on your birthday," and gave her lots of hugs. As he was hugging her, he had another look at the red mark, and he was curious. This didn't seem like an injury or a mark that could have been caused by a slamming door. And that, and the reaction from Rose, sent alarm bells ringing in his head. That morning, Rose and Paul set out to explore Bangkok together for the first time. There was only one problem. In their hotel room, they didn't have a safe, so they had to deposit all their valuables at the hotel reception, where they stored it in a metal tin in the big safe. They set off, and during their wander around the commercial district, Rose saw a beauty salon, and she realized that that day, New Year's Eve, and she wanted to make herself look the best. So she asked Paul if it was okay if she could go to the salon and get her hair and makeup and even her nails done for the party celebrations that evening. That was great with Paul, but there was only one problem. Bangkok prices were really expensive, and they'd only come out with some small money, and both of them hadn't got any credit cards or debit cards on them. So Paul left Rose at the salon and he walked back to the hotel to pick up some money to pay for her visit. During that walk, Paul couldn't help but think about what he'd seen on Rose's back in the shower that morning. That red mark was really bothering him. It was sharper, and the edges of the wound were raised up. He was convinced that that mark couldn't have been caused by the door slamming into Rose's back. He got to the hotel reception and he got the long, thin metal box that contained their valuables. The money and the credit cards was at the back of the tin, but at the front of the tin was Rose's mobile telephone. Rose had told Paul that she didn't want to take it with her because she hadn't got a Thai SIM card. So he was quite surprised when he saw that the phone was switched on. He picked up the phone and he saw that she'd received a message. Paul was thinking, this message might explain the red marks on Rosie's back. So he picked up the phone and he pressed the message to find out what it said. I'll tell you what happened in the final episode next week. If you've enjoyed Paul's story, please like and also subscribe to the channel. Don't forget, you can see the final part of Paul's story 24 hours earlier in the members area next week. If you want to join the members area for extra content and live streams, press join on an Android device or on your internet browser. Thanks for watching, and we'll conclude the story next week.